I guess the basis of this is that we got together recently and had a rambling chat, and we thought this would be good to do regularly. So I'm just adding a sprinkle of context for if this is the point at which we start the video.
I think that's good. Yeah, no, it was a really nice. I think, circled each other's work a little bit, and then
Hmm.
it was really nice to meet and find lots of topics that we wanted to keep digging deeper on.
Yeah, yeah, indeed.
Yeah. And one, I think, yeah, I was throwing out some sort of thoughts, but I agree with you that pontificating on the state of design is it's a bit done. And I don't think we're not going to add anything massive to that conversation. But I really liked your thought about how organizations communicate. And I think
Yeah.
that sits really well with stuff that we were talking about, I think, around rituals and around the way that different groups of people end up with different narratives, perhaps.
Mm.
And I was chatting with another entrepreneurial indie type person who's also in the design and innovation space, who talked about one way that he likes to work with orgs or offers things to orgs is, hey, founders and leaders, isn't it frustrating how you can't get people to understand what it is you want them to do?
Mm.
And that you keep trying to explain yourself, and yet they don't seem to understand what your intent is. And they insist on doing a load of extra stuff that you don't understand why they're doing it. And
Yeah.
hey, teams who are doing all that, isn't it frustrating that you know you need to do all this extra stuff, but the leaders keep complaining about it and bringing in agencies to run around you and stuff like that? So I thought, yeah, might be. There's lots of themes anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah,
what's some
indeed.
experiences you've had of?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like to go back to the roots, it is sort of what my book is about, right? It's teaching people how to be better communicators in general through the kind of Trojan horse of a presentation. But
Yep.
as a general topic, it's been on my mind a lot lately because I'm working with two radically different organizations at the moment in their sort of communication styles, and they share some problems and then, yeah, not others. And I guess I was literally this morning and yesterday having lots and lots of conversations about this. And when you emailed me to say, like, let's figure out what we might talk about. And then I realized that you shared with me this habit that you do with your teams, design teams in the past. And I was like, oh, I haven't made it that explicit, but I have been thinking about that. And I've also been thinking about just how undervalued it is and how it's not spoken about enough. Like everyone's just wandering around assuming they're communicating clearly all the time.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just not the case at all. And it causes so many issues. Anyway, I'm rambling. That's why I thought it might be a nice thing to talk about.
Yeah, I like it. I remember there's a George Bernard Shaw quote which is relevant here, which is the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. Yeah, it's I'm dealing with a culture at the moment that really doesn't like to write things down.
Hmm.
And I even the CEO sort of his girlfriend works at another startup and he was like, wow, they write and chat on Slack a lot. And I was like, yeah, yeah, they do.
Mm.
Yeah, they clarify a lot of stuff. Whereas just this assumption that just conversations is enough. And I
Yeah,
think it also I think there's also like an efficiency thing, like that there's this assumption that writing things down is slow,
yeah,
and that if you're a move fast kind of person, which he definitely is, that slowing down to summarize things, clarify, write things down, or even edit them is just, well, that's a waste of time, isn't it? You know?
right. And well, you put your finger on something there. A founder type tends to be a work with incomplete information. A lot of stuff is tacit. You know what to do. Obviously, just get it done. And
Yeah.
that's how founders get started. That's how they get a business going in the first place. You're never going to get a business going if you're spending all your time writing business plans and clarifying your thoughts, but never doing anything.
Yeah.
So founders, I think I find they always lean that way,
Yeah.
but they get to that tricky point, don't they? There's a point where they've now grown a team and just get things done that are obvious stops working.
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's a number of sort of growing pains that come along with that. This same founder got really slightly sniffy recently when somebody said stakeholders. You know, he's like, he doesn't want to think of himself as a stakeholder.
No,
But actually, you've
I'm
hit
just
the
one of the
size.
team guys.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But you've hit the size where no, you actually really do have to think about these things
Yeah,
and treat the communication differently. Or that shit rolls downhill thing. If you want people to really clarify things to each other and to you, you're going to have to really change the expected behaviors, unconsciously so, right? Or you do them unconsciously so that everyone does them unconsciously, if that makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah. I see. Yeah, so the sort of well, what I've just been writing about the idea of like energy gradients in organizations and how what you make easy will happen more, what you make hard will happen less.
Yeah.
And actually, it's a little note to add in, I think, before I publish, is that a lot of what makes energy gradients easy and hard inside organizations, in cultures, is really soft, tacit signals. It's when are you sort of frowned at, or when does somebody go, well, why did you do that? Versus,
Mm,
oh, that's amazing. Look at this. Oh, celebrate this person. They've really smashed it. Um, those sorts of things make a massive difference to what people do and don't do. Um,
yes.
reminds
Uh,
me of, have you seen, I've forgotten who wrote it now. Someone wrote a piece, Plebs Don't Attend User Research.
no, tell me about it.
So it's a classic. I'm going to have to find out who wrote this and link it in the description.
Hmm.
Actually, I can't do that because I'm not verified on LinkedIn. I'll link it in a comment. But it points out that in the early days of any company, everyone's doing customer research. Everyone's connected to customers, especially the founders. They are out there just selling, making sales, getting
Mm,
raw feedback all the time.
mm,
And as the company grows and gets to this sort of stage that you're talking about, the founder's busy doing other stuff. Like they need to handle the capital side of the business, they need to manage operations. It becomes much more internally focused and they have to move away from the day to day and they have to move away from the customers. What tends to happen then is there are user researchers brought in and research sessions happen, but the founder
mm,
doesn't have time to go there. And what this
yeah.
signals to everyone in the organization is powerful people don't go. And
Yeah.
so the people who want to get powerful think that they tend to copy the behaviors that powerful people do. Act
Mm,
for the job that you want, not the job that you have. And this creates a sort of stigma almost of actually paying attention to research, which is not what the founder wants, because the founder knows they got where they got to by
yeah.
understanding customers deeply.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a weird sort of perceived middle management gap there, isn't there? Right. Yeah. I have to give credit to the founder I'm working with, intensely customer focused in the conversations, talking to people all the time, despite the scale. In fact, everyone. I'm fortunate to be working in a very customer focused with a very customer focused startup.
That's great. Yeah.
I That growing pains thing. So related to this is that literally this morning I was mapping out with user research people. So they've been asking me for a few months, how should we synthesize and communicate this differently? And so I suggested what we should do. I, I should give them credit. They have a pretty major impact on the roadmap. They're not without influence at all. And in fact, it's spoken about commonly. But they were asking me, okay, how do we make sure that these long-term user pains don't get ignored and that we put stuff on the roadmap that's actually going to solve some real long-term and often loyalty oriented user problems, right? Not sort of
Mm,
short-term growth ones. And we did this
yeah.
really interesting exercise where I said, okay, well, let's do some working backwards from how something, so start with a small insight, right? But that could be mission critical, something you've learned about users. And then we'll go to like in a year or two, how has that spiraled into like a major change in strategy. Let's say it's actually secretly super important to customer loyalty. And then what we did was we worked backwards from that change. So we went through all the stages of what would happen in the organization from this one tiny insight to doing a bit more research, synthesizing it differently to how you socialize that knowledge, which cycles does it come up in? Is it quarterly? Is it annual? When would you capitalize on, organizational momentum basically to make a change?
Mm.
And so I hadn't actually ever done something like this, but this idea of like not thinking of it just as that one-off communication, but just like how do we propagate a small little pebble turning into this massive rock that changes something for both the business and customers. And it was a really interesting exercise, which possibly I could turn into something shareable as to where it went. And maybe that might be useful to people. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean that it's one that I bang on about a lot, but it reminds me, I think I
Yeah.
mentioned this to you, The Ideal Present by Jay Bloom,
Mm,
which has a sense of what's going on right now, what's the current mess, and
mm,
then what's the default future mess. If we don't do anything, if we don't get our insights across, where's the business gonna be? Oh, well, we haven't worked on those things at all. The loyalties continue to get worse, etc., etc. Well,
mm,
then let's map out what's the ideal future where all of those the problems of today and the problems of the future are gone, and it's all a wonderful sunlit uplands and everyone's happy. And
mm,
then let's come back to the present and say what's something absolutely tiny, like you're saying, a little pebble we could place in a stream today that
mm.
might have a chance of diverting a little bit towards the ideal, a little bit more away from the
Yeah.
from the mess.
Yeah.
And it's just those, what can we do today that's small that starts to make that
Mm,
change? Jabe says it's his answer to how do we manage the evolutionary potential of the present rather
mm.
than trying to set an idealistic target in the future and then engineer our way there. And I
Yeah.
like there's a sort of sense in what you're describing of we're starting with that tiny change today. We're going to map forward to a possible future, but we're going to, it reminds me of future backwards as well. What are the sort of stories on the way back from that
Yeah.
that could get us
Yeah.
somewhere like that?
Well, it was an interesting exercise in the end for me because what I realized was that the original question, how should we change how researchers communicated and synthesize it, was literally sort of the very, very last thing we ended up doing when we worked backwards.
Yeah.
So it was like, had an insight, synthesize it differently, and then all this organizational stuff later on that led up to a massive roadmap change. And they were sort of quite confused for a long time as we worked backwards, like
Right.
this isn't that's the question we asked, you Ben. But then at the end, like this is two things. Oh, that's okay. Now they're starting to see how those pebbles might turn into multipliers of things that happen in future.
Right. And you were so you got them to kind of map out, well, how do decisions actually get operationalized in this company in the first place?
Yeah, exactly.
Then you're seeing, right, that's the narratives to plug into.
Yeah. I haven't read Teresa Torres, but it reminds me, like I've been talking about this concept of continuous discovery, that I think one of the problems here is this ever present now that you're sort of talking about, that like when does something get crystallized? How does it evolve? How often should it be communicated? When does it get kind of solidified? I think was the sort of question on my mind.
Right.
That I think user researchers in startups anyway certainly find very difficult
Yeah.
to and it reminded me of the problem of sort of science papers. Like I worked on a science journal, a sort of progressive new financial model science journal called eLife years ago. And what they were saying is that science has a real problem because its main unit of communication is a paper.
Yeah.
And that's actually not how the knowledge evolves at all. It's just that that was the physical constraint potentially hundreds of years ago, right? Now it's more
Of
like a wiki,
course.
right? A single scientist is adding to a body of knowledge over time, and they're usually working on the same subject, right? They've usually got their speciality, and each paper is just kind of some new tweak evolution of it. But it doesn't feel continuous because it's papers, right? And I think user research may be suffering from a similar thing there, where we haven't quite, most people and most organizations haven't cracked that idea of like, how do we express this continuous growth of knowledge,
Yeah. And I think it speaks to how uh, what a sort of wrong idea of scientific knowledge a lot of organizations have
Yeah.
with and it gets no beef about the idea of like insights and
Mm,
how people want to be able to go, well, we did a research session and therefore we must mechanically churn out insights, and the
mm,
insights will then cause changes.
mhm.
And that's not how science works at all. That's not how any of it works.
No.
Uh, and I think there's something in the sense of Donella Meadows' idea of like you need to dance with the system. There's a
Yeah.
sense of like when are things ready for the story to change, for an insight to update somebody's like, oh, there's a different story that is available to us now. That's when the organization can start to propagate new possibilities, new options. And it
Yeah.
reminds me a little bit of, do you know Nora Bateson?
No.
Worth looking into. She does a lot of work with the idea of warm data,
Hmm.
but one of her ideas is readying, ready dash ing, uh, which is an organization, an organism, a culture has to go through quite a lot of invisible under the surface readying
Mm.
before new growth, new changes can happen. You can't just decide that you want to change and then
Yeah.
that happen. Although that's a lot of our theory of change, is that set the target and then just force your way there. When you would look at how things work in sort of reality, it tends to be a lot of sort of quiet stuff that nobody really realizes happening. And then there's an
Mm.
opportunity in the world or something happens that's not even linearly related to what ends up changing, but it creates possibilities that then people capitalize on.
Yeah, you've just made me realize something about that exercise I did this morning with him, which was that a lot of what we were implicitly talking about is what the nemawashi, what the Japanese called nemawashi, that idea of like preparing the soil for change. I think that's the original agricultural term, but it's
Oh, I love that. Okay,
so
yeah.
it now means in business culture like meetings before meetings, you know.
Right, okay. Oh no.
It's yeah, like really, really annoying kind of stuff that we would find annoying, but actually is very common in Japan where you have to go and prepare your stakeholders for the thing you're going to say anyway. You check in
Right.
with them. And particularly hierarchical cultures need a lot of sort of, preparing the soil. But I think it's actually happening in any organization. It speaks to what you were saying, right? These small, tacit, unconscious things that are just flowing through an organization. And actually, when we mapped it out today, I was sort of saying, like, well, there's going to be, like, let's say a big roadmap was agreed in a quarterly or annual change on, there would be a lot of groundwork and casual conversations happening before that to help people understand this huge problem you've identified that build up to that big swing. And
Hmm. Yeah.
it's that same thing. It's nemawashi. It's the conversations before the conversations. It's what you were talking about, like that there's that flow there. And I think it's another thing we don't visualize or conceptualize very well in a way.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And it makes that's what makes it hard, I think, for researchers, like you say, especially to know how can we be more influential.
Mm.
And it's funny when researchers then, I had to learn this, I'm sure you had to learn this too, stop worrying about trying to make everybody understand customers the way you do and start understanding how your organization works and thus how you can intervene or influence.
Yeah.
Um, and
Jane
it's
Austen Jane Austen says UX research your organization.
yeah, love it. She's
Yeah.
very smart.
She is. Yeah.
Yeah,
Learned a
knows
lot. Yeah.
knows what's up. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sad I never got a chance to work with her directly, but the influence still pervades.
Yeah.
Um, but I love that. Yeah, that Nemawashi idea. Also, I was talking earlier with Carissa, my partner from the podcast as well, about we tend to this guy, and I've seen this from someone who did like deciphering Sun Tzu. I think a reading of that, but we tend to have in the West a sort of cause and effect view of things, that
Mm.
things must be linearly causal. Whereas in the East, Japan, China, etc., it tends to be more conditions and consequences. which
mm,
sounds more that Nemawashi. You've got to prepare lots of aspects of the ground to enable something to happen. It doesn't cause it to happen. You're
yeah,
just changing propensities
yeah.
potentially.
I don't know whether I read this in Scott McCloud's How Comics Work or something like that, but I read some research once that was related to this where they were looking at how people perceive art and like comics as well. And they noticed in the research doing it internationally that people from Eastern cultures tend to focus on background details first and then move to the foreground, whereas
Uh,
Westerners are all foreground, right?
mhm.
And ignore the background, right? It's this very kind of like this, then this.
Yep.
And so that probably says something about film and photography and how this stuff is perceived and yeah, what you think is important about something that's being communicated to you and then how you deal with that in time and space and socially. I think there's a connection there between what you were saying about understanding the conditions of something
Yep.
versus the 1+1, which is, kind of maybe our approach.
Yeah. It's reminded me of something else. There's a cultural thing where as Western people will tend to notice about 3% of what's in front of us.
Mm.
Chinese people tend to notice about 6%. So it's
Yeah,
still not much, but it's
yeah,
twice as much. And it is much more the context,
yeah,
and yeah, those kind of background details, which turn out to be much more important in
yeah,
how decisions are made, etc., than
yeah,
the sort of individual, we're agentic,
yeah,
atomistic sort of people who are free-willed and we can do what we want, self-sovereign.
yeah. I got some hard lessons in this teaching design stuff in Japan last year and learning about how work is presented.
Oh, so cool. Tell me more.
Yeah, well, so I mean, presenting, I think most people would know that like presenting in Japan is quite a different art because of nemawashi, this idea that you have to save face at all times, right? You're not allowed to surprise anyone really. Everyone sort of has to know what's going on beforehand. So you have to go and do the presentation 6 times before you show it to the main meeting, and then it's a formality. Um, and then, I kind of very consciously was teaching designers some of the tricks I use, but then I did sort of say, like, look, this is a buffet. I have no idea what will work here and what won't. But one of the things, coming back to like what you observe, is that a lot of Japanese leaders will request as much detail on slides or on sheets of paper as possible, and then they will do the work of sorting through what's important because they're in general much better at scanning. Like if you look at Japanese newspapers, right, incredibly dense, people are actually better at kind of scanning naturally
Interesting.
and picking out what's important. And so, I was told that my sort of, 7 to 10 words only on a slide is like doesn't really fly in that, Western audiences need that kind of zoomed in, this is the only important thing, don't get distracted by anything else. Whereas the habit in Japan anyway is present me with a bunch of stuff, talk about it, but I will decide like what I'm going to take from this. So very, very different way of thinking about how to
Yeah,
present
that's
information.
really different. And then
Yeah.
surely every person in that audience is taking a different thing from it.
I don't know. I mean, it's funny. Like you could very easily get into the sort of the pros and the cons, but
Mm.
it's too hard to say, right? I don't know.
Yeah, which then thinking about it, like probably I suspect that even in the Western style thing, where you try to guide people through, people are
Yeah,
still taking different things from it because we perceive it all through our own
yeah,
perception anyway.
yeah. I mean, I think the thing there is, so so Japanese culture is what's called the highest context culture in the world, where um, you you need an awful lot of context to be able to understand what's actually being said. Whereas,
Okay.
whereas like the Netherlands is the lowest context culture. People are extremely direct. There's absolutely zero ambiguity.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe that has something to do with being an island culture cut off from other countries for hundreds of years with zero immigration. Maybe there's no directness needed, right? Everyone has a very, very advanced understanding of culture and what's being unsaid. But yeah, for an outsider, that can be extremely confusing and difficult to know how to navigate.
Oh, I can well imagine it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's yeah. I wonder. I'm wondering where then the sort of British thing fits
I know
within
a bit
that
about this.
scale.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've got the book here somewhere. There's a wonderful book on this called The Culture Map.
Oh yes, I've got that one. Yeah,
Yeah, by Erin Meyer. Sorry, I
yeah.
won't grab it because it's too far away. But she does sort of talk about these measures internationally, and I'm going to probably paraphrase it badly, but British people are relatively middling to low context in world terms, but relatively high context in European terms.
Yeah. That
Um,
feels
which,
immediately
yeah.
right.
Another thing in there is that places with higher immigration tend to work on a lower context because you can't assume so much about the people you're with.
Yeah.
That you'll have that same shared understanding. I mean, honestly, I got deeply interested in this stuff because, most of my family are Dutch, but I was raised here. And
Ah,
so there's this
interesting.
enormous difference in what context and directness means. And I think I didn't kind of realize how different my family culture was until I was quite a bit older, and understanding that context. And I still think I'm a bit of an idiot in British culture sometimes, you know.
A bit too blundering about.
Yes.
You don't
Yeah.
say that out loud, Ben.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But it was nice. In fact, I believe the guy that came up with the measures of culture, Geert Hofstede, it was actually inspired by the difference between Dutch and British people. Like the very first measures of culture, scientific measures of culture, were actually because I think he was in the Dutch Navy, like the merchant navy, and he was going around the world. And one of his early observations was he found the difference between Dutch people and British people to be bigger than Dutch and Indonesian, for example. And he was like, how do I think about this difference? Like, what is this difference? And then he started to come up with these measures. So, yeah, directness is one, context. It's called context, but it really just means directness. Um, Power distance is the other one. Have you heard of this one?
No.
So power distance is how freely can you speak to people in power?
Okay. Yeah.
And
Makes sense.
and it's really weirdly counterintuitive stuff. Like you might think you could start to label cultures quite easily on that basis, but I found it to be really difficult.
Yeah.
So, for example, the French, which have a very rebellious kind of um, egalitarian, traditionally culture, have high power distance. So one of the ways this might manifest itself is that people won't speak out in meetings. They won't challenge their teacher if they're studying. There won't be questions at the end of a class. It's just assumed you're in power. I shut up when you talk.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas British people who have quite a tight hierarchy, most unequal place in Europe, you would think that we weren't that free to speak to our superiors, but actually we are. And so there's all these weird counterintuitive levers on culture that, again, are they the ultimately measures of culture? Probably not, but they're the
No.
ones that have sort of been kind of explored the most over the last few decades. Yeah.
It's interesting when you talk about it that way, it connects immediately with experiences teaching dance internationally.
Mm.
So I teach Lindy Hop, which is
Oh, right. Wow.
partnered swing dance
I'd love to
originated in
try
the
it.
30s and 40s.
Yeah.
I highly recommend it. There is some round your way, so you
Yes.
can find it. And if you're ever
Yeah.
over this way, then come and join the classes. We're doing some beginners courses soon. But yeah, so I've taught that all around mainly Europe. Yeah, Europe really. So Ireland and but also with people coming from all over the place as well.
Mm.
And you can really notice then who asks questions in class and who
Yeah.
doesn't. And yeah, I think the Scandinavians won't ask questions, for
No.
instance,
Yeah.
whereas the British people will. And there's even a certain like there's a flavor of British person who you get in every class who is this is more of a comment than a question, that sort of person.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
think you'll
I
find
know
that the
this
way you're
exact.
teaching it isn't the right way. I can't tell you that directly, but I can ask a
Yeah.
question.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I've experienced this. One of my favorite workshop experiences were teaching in Finland a few years ago. And the Finnish are sort of famously non-reactive, stone-faced about things, no questions at the end.
Yep.
And then I did a day-long workshop with a group of people, and then you go to the bar, and I'm really confused and self-conscious. Like, was this useful? And they're like, no, it was great. It was the best workshop I've been to in years. I'm like, well, but you
I
didn't.
couldn't tell.
Yeah, I knew nothing, about what you actually felt. Um,
Yeah, I walked out of that room thinking you hated me. So
yeah,
throw
yeah.
me a
I mean,
bone here.
it's funny because I haven't figured this out yet, but I do, Dutch society does work and design things well for its citizens in general. There's a ton of problems there, but if you consider travel and transport, they've got it cracked in a way that most countries are still struggling with. And I do attribute their ability to constantly challenge each other directly and not take it personally as kind of a secret weapon. Like
Mm.
it's a super cool thing that you can do, that you can have people say, like in a team or even in a family, this is absolutely true. You can kind of say, I don't really like you, and everyone's cool. Like no one takes it badly,
Which is like, wow, that hits me
Yeah.
right here. Like, oh
Yeah, it's
God. Yeah.
horrifies British people, right? But then you can have much more honest conversations about what's going on. So I haven't quite figured out like, well, when you have like a society that's got a few sort of things figured out, like how did communication and style of culture play a part in that? Like, what was the impact there? And is that even the real reason? I don't know.
Oh, and then, well, then how did Japanese culture get the way that it is versus Dutch culture get the way that it is
Mm,
versus British culture? And it just goes back and back and back. And
yeah.
well, it's non-causal, non-linear, but you also can't necessarily change it. And then the other big thing is you can't then take a system that works in one culture and
Mm,
transplant it into another culture and have it work.
no.
So Spotify model being a classic example that
Yeah,
everyone went,
that's
oh,
exactly what I was thinking about. Yeah, transplanting that directly. Yeah.
yeah, from a Swedish company that didn't use it itself either,
Mm.
and then just applying that in random other countries and hoping.
Is that true? They don't even use it themselves. I have
No,
no
no,
idea.
it was written up as a blog article, which is kind of this is a thing that we're thinking about getting towards. We're on the way, but it's not fully there.
Oh,
And then they evolved past it anyway. But it caught on. It was one of those little cultural moments, and it just went
yeah.
absolutely wild.
Yeah. I think it was one of those moments where it just made so much more sense than anything else that had come before that it was assumed to be right in a way.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's in the absence of models that seemed to make sense, it just became a de facto thing that people spoke about. I actually
It,
I remember working with an organization a while ago, and some stakeholder went, please just stop talking about the Spotify model. Not to me, but to some colleagues. It's like, yeah, it's so done. It doesn't work here. Please shut up about it.
yeah. But if we just do it
Yeah.
more and harder, maybe it'll eventually work.
Spotify harder, yeah.
That's it. And I remember giving a talk at it was a CX conference for fintech, like really quite niche. But I talked to a room of like 100 senior CX professionals, and I had two things in my talk. One was about the continuous discovery that we'd
Mm,
developed and like constant user exposure for everyone on the team, and the other half was about the Spotify model. And
mm.
what shocked me was fewer than half the people in the room of CX professionals, senior leadership level, had ever even observed a usability test when I got them to stick
Oh
their hands up.
wow. Yeah.
And everyone was only interested in the Spotify model, not in the idea of talking to customers at all or observing customers. And it just was this, it's this thing like, oh my God, most
Yeah.
people would rather like rearrange the chairs in their building than go
Yes.
outside the building for 5 minutes.
Let's talk about that because it's something that we've all encountered a lot, I think, that allergy to being close to customers.
Yeah.
Um, Having worked in India over the past little while, like that allergy weirdly doesn't seem to be there amongst the startups. They're intensely focused on it all the time. So anyway, I'm just curious, like if we could try to identify what is scary about that? Like, what is it that the dirty, unwashed public that makes people go, I don't want to go near them?
It's a really good question. And I think I'm going to bet that we've both spent over 20 years trying to work out why that's happening and what we can do to sort of shift it. I saw somebody, I saw an article recently that now I can't remember who it was, but it
Uh,
just sort of, oh, that makes sense. Like when you're building a business, you start out doing everything by hand and very, very close to the customers, but that's unsustainable. You have to get to the point where things are scaling, which
mm,
means you have to abstract certain things and you have to put things in spreadsheets and make processes and stuff like that. And once you start making processes, you you have to start resisting variation that's
mm,
unhelpful.
yeah,
And there's one thing about customers that's true is massive variation and also massive ambiguity. And I
yeah,
think that's something that has I've seen bother people in the past when it comes to like talking to customers. And I think there's two things that you see. One is when you just go and openly observe people in context, there's a certain sort of type of person who's in a lot of businesses who finds that intensely frustrating because it's
mm,
not directly answering the question they wanted to answer
yeah,
right now. A little bit like you with your team doing the workshop and like, hang on, we're doing a load of stuff that doesn't seem to be directly answering the question that we're asking.
yeah,
But actually, it's much more valuable to take the oblique route
hmm,
and sneak up on the answer than it is to directly answer it.
yeah,
And we know that from customer research. The worst way to get an answer from someone is to ask them the question directly. You're
yeah,
going to get lies and misleading stuff. So that's
yeah.
one thing. What was I going to say? The other is no, it's gone.
Well, I've got one that I've had in mind in the past, which I
Yep.
don't think is a fully evidenced thought, but I when I've gotten close to other professions outside of sort of tech world or even UX world, I've noticed a distinct resistance to um, really rapid feedback loops,
Mm,
right? Um, and 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 doing things which are an explicit challenge to the way you think right now is
yeah.
actually far less common than
Yeah.
we realize. And that doing stuff where the sort of goal is to change your own mind is actually a really super scary thing, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, that resonates. And that reminds me of the thing I was going to say, which is how many feedback mechanisms are designed to like attenuate the signal
Mm,
and control the sorts of signals that you're allowed to get back.
yeah.
Writing surveys with a limited number of options, which are the
Mm,
options that you can conceive of internally, and you want the answer to be those.
yeah.
Whereas if you just like I think we go and do this, both of us. Like, no, just go and expose yourself to a customer actually trying to use your thing.
Yeah.
And it is horrifying. And I think I told you about the story of when I accidentally raised the curtain a bit too bluntly and quickly on an organization and usability tested their best ideas in front of
Right.
everybody publicly on one day. And it derailed the entire organization for several months because it was so horrifying.
Yeah.
And it's, yeah, I think you're right. It's got to be carefully done.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we talked about this last time, but there's this deep-seated kind of allergy to the ambiguity that, so it's safety in spreadsheets, it's avoiding rapid feedback loops or ambiguous, messy, noisy signals, as you say.
Yeah. It's layers of reporting so that
Yeah,
you don't have to see all of the information, but only the
yeah.
bits that people want you to see.
And to connect back to what you said earlier, which is maybe something has devalued it at the same time, and that it's something that senior people don't find will help them in their careers.
Yeah.
And so to riff on this, how have you helped on the general theme of getting comfortable with mess and ambiguity? I know this is something you've thought about a lot. So how have you helped organizations and people through that in the past yourself?
Cool. Yeah, that is an excellent question. I want to hear how you've done it as well.
Okay.
But I certainly, there was a point when I was like on fire with the idea of evangelism, and we
Hmm.
need to go and just get better at it. Like we need to stop confirmation biasing ourselves. We need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So
Mm.
I'm going to bang the drum and we're going to make everyone go and do it. And there were elements of it like I'm going to stop you from committing the narrative fallacy. You can't just
Mhm.
make up stories about why things are happening, why this one over that. It's
Mm.
not true. So it didn't work. Like you can't reprogram people's brains, and if you could, it would be unethical to do so. So I
Yeah.
realized, don't stop trying to fight against the natural propensities of people who have really, really helpful, valuable propensities that you don't have, Tom, because
Mm.
you tend to get lost in the ambiguity and the uncertainty, and you enjoy figuring that out. And that doesn't necessarily get action to happen quickly or businesses to get scaled. So you need both of these, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Don't
Yeah.
try and make everyone like you.
Yeah.
And that was a big one. And then I was right, but there's still something that's valuable here. And there's a way that you can, um, yeah, I'll shortcut to the big thing, like the idea of pivot triggers, the idea of making multiverse maps, which came a
Mm.
little bit later, was a way of getting a very fast feedback loop with a team very quickly and looping right back to what we had at the start. When you've got a culture, as many cultures are, which thinks we can have a conversation about this and then we'll all understand each other, I think people get to certain common frustrations. Like,
Mm.
hang on a minute, I thought we agreed on this, and now you've gone and done that. That's not what I wanted. We're going to have to
Mm.
redo it. And I
Mm.
think people can start to feel when that's happening. And often the instinct is, well, let's have more conversations harder. Let's have status reports and updates, and you can tell me about all the work that you've been doing. And what this creates is just a fire hose of information, which, unless you're Japanese, you're not very good at sifting through to find out what matters.
Mm.
And you kind of need people to tell you what matters. So what I found was instead of trying to have better conversations, make something, put something concrete down on a screen or on a piece of paper while the conversation is happening. Don't make a separate meeting for it and do it as a special exercise. Just do it. And that's what
Yeah.
multiverse mapping is. You just map out, okay, so this idea, there's this thing you're talking about, this feature. We could go off about features for a while. They are the
Yeah.
wrong level of granularity strategy. Uh, it's just a bad abstraction, but it's helpful because it feels like a thing that we can get our hands around.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you're talking about that feature, okay, so let's just tell the story of how does the user, what do they see first? Then what do they do? Then what do they see? Then what do they do? And we lay that out. And every time I do this, and I've done this hundreds of times now, there's always bits where people go, oh yeah, no, they can't. That doesn't fit in there. And oh, our system can't
Mm.
do that. Oh, that's going to be harder than we thought. And are people going to want that? And what you start doing is it's like making a rough, really fast behavioral prototype of the thing that we're talking about building. And then it gives everyone. I've got a friend called Mike who talks about the surprising power of pointing at drawings. And you can just, instead of it being somebody's idea in their head that's all hidden, it now gets out onto a piece of paper and we can all point at it and go, well, hang on, that bit doesn't make sense. And then what I found happened was people would naturally gravitate towards where the most uncertainty was and go, well, we better figure that out. And sometimes that means testing something with users, sometimes it means spiking something in the code base. But that really helped. Did that break up horribly for you?
It did. I'm sure the recording will get it all. Sorry. I missed parts of it. There's something up with my internet, I think. But we'll struggle on. We'll see what happens.
Always high quality.
Um, yeah, I think that thing about not going against the grain, guess I've been through that unconsciously, starting out early career, evangelism, this UX thing. I'm gonna show everyone how it's done, that kind of thing. And then I think as time's gone on, it's been more about in more that sort of inviting people into something new to experience a different way of seeing.
Yeah. Have you
Still,
read The Idea of Open Portals Don't Plant Flags?
no, that's interesting way of putting it. Yeah. Um, Inviting people into this new, weird, interesting thing and just kind of making it fun and slightly infectious to come and see this new way of being.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And suddenly we can share like a new jamming energy around this thing that before was a bit frustrating and boring.
yeah, yeah, for sure. But then also you're in a role where you're expected to synthesize and narrativize things. That
Yep.
hasn't ever really gone away and has a unique power in almost any organization. Um, but yeah, it's that switch and that stage of maturity, I think, where are we at? What are we allergic to? Um, how much change are we making here? Is it to the product or is it to the process? Those kinds of questions come up for me.
Oh yeah, that's always there. And what past scar tissue do we have to avoid? Because
Yeah.
that's not safe to touch anymore.
Yeah, and also like I suppose at the heart of it is like, have you seen that four quadrant culture measurement thing at the back that I reference at the back of my book? The hierarchies, clans, adhocracies, markets model. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Ah, yes, that does ring a bell. Yep.
Yeah. It was introduced to me by Kim Goodwin, but she got it from somewhere else. Apologies, I've forgotten the name of the original authors, but um yeah, always kind of working out the grain of what's valued here and how you cross those bridges and how you translate those things. So, you
Mm.
know, hierarchies valuing predictability, process, right? That's why you need to do the nemawashi in those. Clans valuing safety, consensus, like bringing everybody together around a shared opinion. Adhocracies just valuing the just get shit done quickly, and then markets refusing to do anything until you've got a number in front of somebody.
Yeah.
Um, and then I wouldn't say I've become expert at being an adaptive entity in these places, but you certainly, when you learn about these models and these differences, you start to read the signs and figure out how you might bend like a reed in the wind to work within something.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So that, and then with some of those, I'm thinking cultures where probably you might go, actually, I'll just nope out of this one once you realize what it is.
Yeah, lots of those. Or
Yeah.
you just plow ahead. Like, I mean, I've certainly had this. You plow ahead like you did with your approach, and you just crash and burn. And it doesn't take away from the sort of validity or potential rightness of what you've said, or
Yeah.
strategic power. But those folks just are not ready to hear it. I mean, I've had this, so many times in my career. And it's hard to
True.
predict. It's very, very hard to predict. I don't know that I've ever read the winds or the signs all that successfully in those sort of, particularly in those hierarchical or larger organizations.
Yes. And I've ended up sort of when I've glanced on like larger and very hierarchical organizations, I've tended to bounce off them a bit. I think that's
Yeah.
something that I struggle with. I think you can't go against the tempo of an organization. That's one thing I've learned.
Mm.
So each of those you described has a very different tempo. And if you try to work at a different tempo, it takes an enormous amount of energy to do so. And you're going to end up getting pulled back to the natural tempo. And the
Mm.
organizations that are like, we want to go faster, actually, I think that just wanting to go faster doesn't do anything. You can like
No.
work really hard and go slightly faster for a bit, and then you snap back to where you were.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. A lot of this, the values idea does often manifest itself in how we treat time, for sure. I was having a coaching conversation with a product manager the other day, and they had moved from a very agile, growing startup to an established firm that was designing something vaguely medical, and so had a lot of process, a lot of safety stuff in
Lots
place.
of regulations and safety. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, and she was saying like I literally can't wrap my head around how little I'm doing. You know, like I've maybe made a difference to one button or something in 3 months.
Yeah.
And I was just saying, but that's potentially fine. I mean, maybe by your own personal standards, no, but like, don't necessarily think that the organization is against you for such a small change. Maybe that's just like the way they work. You know what just popped into my head when we've been talking about this is like Samsung, right? like,
Mm.
I often think about sort of the how the Apple versus Android world plays out, right, on the ground, because you have this the people I've spoken to in the past at Samsung are just under this sort of weight of hierarchy at all times. And you just think, how are they at the forefront of this kind of near constant change in the market that they're in compared to the Silicon Valley style way of working?
Yeah.
Like, I'd really love to know how the pace and the values culture plays out internally, because in my mind, it just doesn't compute right. You know, I can't figure it out.
Yeah. And it's, gosh, it reminds me of something I saw John Cutler sharing, which is from, he's talking with a friend at Amazon who said, people tout Amazon as this wonderful
Mm.
place, working backwards, writing culture, etc., etc. But this is actually the most feature factory place I've ever been. Like it's loads of process and road mapping, and the writing culture is actually overdone a little bit.
Mm.
And so it's still great. He's very excited to be there, but it's not necessarily this halcyon wonderland that it gets touted as.
No, but I think the reason we reflect on that isn't just their success, it's the way that those guiding ideas have been communicated both internally and externally. Because in most of the organizations I've ever worked in, there were no guiding ideas,
Yeah, yes,
you
that is
know?
true. Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
or they were completely unconscious and never made explicit. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I was reflecting on the for two by two you were listing with
Mm.
adhocracy and market.
Mm.
I think thinking back to companies I've worked at, it was all of them. Different
Hmm. Oh yeah.
elements played out in different ways and in different timelines,
Yeah.
but you had to move between those fluidly actually to understand what was going on. And I think the people who are good, like power brokers, people who are good at power,
Mm.
have an intuitive sense of this stuff and know how to play all those games and
For
make it
sure.
happen. And people who aren't have to use two by twos and like think it through and go, what's going on here? Why isn't
Yeah.
this working?
Yeah. Yeah. I do. Yeah. There's something there about where you're spending your effort, and like how much do you double down on X, Y, or Z area of discipline. And for sure, I don't think designers are terribly inclined to do all that power broking people stuff for whatever reason. And
No.
that's why we end up having conversations like this.
Yes. And why
Um,
we end up, well, not really having chief design officers, for
mm,
instance, in the
yeah.
C-suite. And why, getting back to the sort of, we're a little bit on the state of design today, but
Oh
how,
no.
but I think one way that you could slightly meanly joke about product managers, and I see myself as very much a product person, product manager as well,
Yeah.
it's designers who aren't great at design, but are great at politics.
Mm,
And
yeah.
that's where they come in and take over from the designers, because they don't go, well, we need to follow this big long process and we don't know this, and you can't really do it like that, mate. And they just go, yeah, yeah, what do you want done? We'll get that done. Bosh, sorted.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. rather than agonizing over what the right thing to do is. Yeah.
Exactly. Which we know it has its benefits, but it
Mm.
has massive costs as well. That's hard.
Yeah, for sure. And it's that thing of like picking which battles do I double down on. Um, yeah, I was having a conversation earlier today with a designer who um, is essentially in the overthinking loop a lot of the time
Yeah.
and trying to help them navigate. Okay, it, the overthinking thing that we're inclined to do is this, double-edged sword. It's like being able to think beyond the problem that somebody handed you and taking it at face value is immensely awesome.
Yeah.
But then you just keep getting stuck in these troughs and
Yeah.
not knowing how to escape them.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. There's
what's
a
the
couple of classic traps, aren't there?
mm,
There is the actually, there is no good option. All of the
yeah.
options are bad.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get stuck because you're looking for a beautiful puzzle piece that slots in and makes
Yeah.
everything good.
Yeah.
Or there is the like the ladder of concerns trap where it's not the button that's the problem, it's the landing page. It's not the landing page, it's the concept. It's not the concept, it's the business model. It's not the business model, it's capitalism. And
Yeah.
suddenly you find yourself with like, in order to solve this button problem, we're going to have to bring down capitalism. And
Yeah.
it's not a helpful way to go.
No. No. Where did we start with all this? We started with how
So
organization,
communication.
yes,
Yeah, how
how
organizations
how,
communicate.
how organizations communicate.
And that touches, I think I'm wanted to talk about like where we got to with designers and getting stuck in these sorts of problems. It
Mm,
reminds me of a colleague from years ago. Shout out to Bailey Cursor, who's a really smart founder and just get things done type awesome person. And she was working contracting at this company that we were at, where the there was just a real talking past each other between the executive leadership team and the design organization.
mm.
And she came in and made a non-violent communication matrix, which was
Okay.
just explaining to each side what it was that we were missing about the other side. And it was fascinating because the designers were focused on this kind of there is a right way to do product design, and
Hmm.
we need to know what the actual objective is, and we need to work backwards from that and understand the user problems, and then we can design the right solution. And the executives were basically saying, we don't know what the objective is. We can't know what the objective is. We just want something that's better than what it is today. And what
Mm,
we want you to do is give us some options because we don't really know what we're trying to achieve, and we need help
mm,
to sense out what might be good and what might not be good.
mm-hmm.
And the designers were refusing to make those options. And I was part of this design team at the time.
Right.
And it was a real sort of watershed for me. And I
Mm.
think moved me along the way to, do you know what? You can't always know the objectives. There isn't
No.
always a right answer. And when we get trapped in that process, it's not helpful. So yeah, I found
Yeah,
myself then as when I was like leading design teams,
mm,
a lot of the time it was like what you were saying, just stop, help people to get themselves out of those ruts.
yes. Yeah, for sure. Like I think a lot of people just they don't see it as their role to facilitate that clarity or that, purpose or direction. And so they get stuck on what other people are not doing.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, I can see it both ways, right?
Yeah.
I think it's in Julie Zhao's book. I don't, you've read The Making of a Manager.
Bit of it. Yeah, I think so.
I think she talks about three things. I'm trying not struggling to remember it perfectly, but it's the things that you as a leader must bring to a team are paraphrasing, purpose, process, performance. I think I'm forgetting the latter bits, but that purpose thing, like what are we working towards and why? I do think that the most common issue I've ever experienced in organizations is leaders who don't realize that's their job. Their job is to clarify what that means. Now, can I be that person at the ground level who then goes and helps them clarify? Sure. But there is most commonly this gap between, okay, that's the thing that you should be doing more than anything else, right? What are
Yeah.
we all working towards? And then that secondary issue, coming back to what we started with, is how have you communicated it, or have you communicated it adequately or in enough detail?
Yeah.
The one I've often noticed people miss is even if they get to here's what we want, the why just isn't there. Oh, well, I told you what we want. Yeah, but like teams need to know like why, right?
Yeah. Why does
Because
this matter?
yeah, otherwise it's just this kind of why are we doing this again? Like
Yeah.
no one wants to be in that position, you
Which
know?
ties into the idea of context. Like, what is the
Yes.
context?
Yeah.
And then there's the question of the other thing you said about can you challenge power? What
Mm,
if the team sees that information and goes, hang on a minute, this is incoherent with the context? What you
yeah.
think the context is isn't what is happening on the ground. Can we then challenge you back?
Yeah. Can we add some of the context, or can we bring you in to feel some of that context by
Yeah,
getting closer to users, or, whatever that context
making a
needed is?
multiverse map, showing some
Okay,
pivot
right.
triggers. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
that sort of thing.
nice. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Going, so you're assuming that users will jump from here to here over this massive chasm. Are you sure that's going to happen? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, indeed.
that kind of thing. And does it then? I wonder at the moment there's this sense of glue people being got rid of from organizations, but
Mm,
there's a kind of cultural translation job here. And I recognize what you're saying. The last job I had, I felt very much I was in a role of I could understand very clearly where the leadership level, what they were saying and what they wanted to have happen, and the sort
hmm
of business language.
hmm
And I could also understand the product managers and the designers and the researchers and what they were trying to tackle. And so it kind of fell on me to do the translation back and forth a little bit
mm,
because they
yeah,
weren't really able to understand each other.
yeah,
Um, and that
yeah,
was an interesting
yeah.
challenge.
I've been in an organization recently where it was sort of somewhere in the middle, where very heavy amounts of jargon from leadership was just really making a lot of things quite insular and difficult. Um, but they were really open to being challenged on it. I'm not saying I necessarily changed their behaviors, but there wasn't that resistance. There was like a complete acknowledgement, like, oh yeah, I can see how I'm completely confusing new employees, users, partner organizations by just overdosing on kind of acronyms and so on.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was the beginning of this slow conversation. Like, why don't we just translate that? Let's use this word instead of that word or that acronym. And it was nice to sort of be pushing against a relatively open door for once, you know?
Yeah. I mean that
Mhm,
it feels that's back to the your product manager you were coaching, who
mhm.
it is frustrating when you're doing all this effort. It doesn't feel like you're getting anywhere.
Yeah,
And it's one of the tough things about working on cultural issues is the feedback loops are very, very slow.
yeah,
And you're putting a lot of pebbles in streams
yeah,
and seeing what consequences emerge
yeah.
downhill.
It's funny. I called my company Clouds and Clocks, right?
Yeah,
After Karl Popper. And you just reminded me of like, we're talking about cloud problems mostly.
yeah,
And this is really sort of like funny example in recent modern history of like the sort of weather hacking that's been going on in the Middle East. I forget which city it was that were doing it. And did you hear about this? Like all this
no,
flooding? I think it was in Dubai or maybe Abu Dhabi. They were doing like, you know, it's actually sort of like, weather engineering, like flying planes, dumping
seeding
chemicals on
clouds
clouds.
with
Yeah,
Silver Nitrate
exactly.
and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, but then an entire city that has never had a single flood was just completely underwater.
Wow.
And so that idea of like,
Classic unintended consequences.
yeah, like literally a literal cloud that you tried to force a
Yeah.
clock solution on, and it just completely blew up in your face.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a lovely metaphor for we've got a messy cloud problem, like ambiguous user situation type thing. And what we're going to
yeah,
do is impose a process on it and then
yeah,
hope it doesn't blow up in our face.
yeah, yeah. What's the not going against the grain way of doing that? Like, I'm sure climatologists have answers to this, but like, what's the way in which you can engineer some sort of progress in that without smacking against the grain of what the weather wants to do, basically?
That is the ultimate challenge, isn't it? Because I found it is like the top level answer, I think, is multiple parallel safe to fail probes.
Mm,
So that form of cloud engineering, we're going to at scale seed all the clouds. We know what's going to happen. We're going to fix it.
yeah.
It's a little bit like we're going to bring in safe at scale for everyone. Everyone's now agile, and you just know it's a world of pain coming. Like that company's going to be underwater
Yeah.
in a few months.
But those probes are a harder sell, aren't they?
They are, yeah, because you are basically saying, hey, you know all the ambiguity you hate and all that uncertainty. What I'm going to ask you to do is lean into it more.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm not going to get promoted for making 10 small bets, whereas like a big successful thing will make me, get promoted or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the only way, the way that I've started to see it maybe being saleable is
Mm.
it's not a replacement for what you're doing. It's a pre-process. It's a de-risking strategy.
Yeah, for sure. For
So
sure. Yeah.
you're gonna, if you do these 50 small bets in the next 2 weeks, then
Mm.
you're gonna get signals that tell you which big bet it's gonna
Mm.
be a good idea for you to stake your career on.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed.
But there are, like you said, in cultures, there are certain business cultures where that's just not going to fly at all. And there's a lot of readying
No.
and nemawashi to do before that can even be
Yeah.
considered, before it's even a viable option.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Or like just doing the thing is requires so much investment in the first place that it has to be big, you know? Like I I saw this thing about, all these fusion initiatives, right?
Yeah,
Building tokamaks to create fusion power. I read this one about the big one in Europe that's been going since the 80s. And they were like, we had to ask for billions from all the governments in Europe or even around the world, because it made it too big to fail.
right. Of course. So then, yeah,
Yeah.
once we've got the billions, we
Then
get to
when
keep
we ask for the
going.
next, yeah,
Yeah.
when we ask for that next billion, have to keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it
Gosh.
was funny to hear like a scientist or a funding person literally go, no, 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 there was no way that this was ever going to fly if we asked for a few million quid to experiment with fusion.
Yeah.
It had to start as a monolith. And it's still going. It was like Margaret Thatcher like was the person who funded it originally, and it was just like
Wow.
she was just like, yeah, billions, here you go. Um,
Gosh.
yeah.
And there's an interesting question there. Have they made progress that is worth all of that investment?
Yeah, and I mean, the article was sort of suggesting no, but has the field made progress? I'm sure. And maybe there's been some knowledge transfer, who knows?
Yeah, I know that they have made progress in fusion, but I know
Yeah,
it's been 20 years away for 50 years.
yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah, 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 indeed.
and continues to be so, yeah.
I think
And then
that,
there's a whole other conversation about the idea of obliquity and the myth of objectives, which we could
mm,
get into. Maybe that's next time.
yeah, yeah, sure. I'd love to know more about that. Um, yeah, cool.
Cool, but lovely. I think that's
Yeah,
I think we've
let's leave it
solved it
there.
all now. So that's good.
Nice. Yeah, yeah. Cool. Well,
Yeah.
this was fun talking about all this weird shit.
Yeah, this was good. Hopefully, I think yeah, we can publish this and hopefully people will find little snippets to draw ideas on and yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I'd certainly love it if people are happening to watch this and have got this far through it. If there's something that's piqued your interest, if there's an idea that you would like to share with us, then we'd love to hear.
Yeah, for sure.
Fab. Well, thanks so
And t
much, Ben.
yeah, and tell us if we're full of shit.
Oh yeah, definitely that. We like we like to be challenged. We're
We're in
comfortable
that
with
type.
ambiguity. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
good.
Okay, cool.
Thank you so much.